Well, I'm here with two of my not only favorite astrologers, but two of my most inspired or sources of greatest astrological inspiration. Demetra George, who is one of my favorite authors, as well as one of my really primary influences in astrology, as well as teachers and guides, and somebody I've worked with, and just very honored to have you here, as well as Jason Holley, who is my friend now for over a Jupiter cycle, right? And colleague and another source of great astrological inspiration and guidance for me as well with all of your body of work. And the context of us getting together right now to talk about Ceres in astrology is that Jason and I have been facilitating a course about Mercury, Chiron, and Ceres, and we've been calling it the Twilight Planets, sort of folding them into sects, so making sort of our own imaginal Twilight sect in a way of Mercury, Chiron, and Ceres. And so we were inspired to reach out to you, Demetra, as you have written Asteroid Goddesses, which I think for most people is really their starting point with coming into relationship with Ceres and astrology. I know it was for me. I'll never forget finding your book in a used bookstore in Santa Cruz, and I think it was like 2006 maybe. I wasn't really on the internet much, and not I was only vaguely familiar. I always would go to bookstores and try to find books, but I hadn't actually come across your work before, which is kind of amazingly to think about that now. And I was really into mythology and goddesses, and I was like, this is like the most incredible book I've ever found when I came across that, and just opening all of that up for me. And I know you've served that role for so many people with regard to the goddesses and all mythology, and bringing that into astrology, as well as additionally in more recent decades bringing back the whole Hellenistic material and everything with that. But one of the things we just wanted to start talking about with you, just we were thinking it would be interesting just to ask you about what were some of your own personal, earliest memories of coming into relationship with her, whether that's through Demeter or Ceres, just what were some of the formative experiences you had with her?
Right. My response to that is that my connection with Siri started way before I was born.
Mm.
And I'm not actually talking from past life perspective here, but of a actually more literal. When I was born, my mother named me Margarita after her mother. And that's my first birth certificate. And
Mm.
then when it came time for me to be baptized in the Greek Orthodox Church, the my godmother refused to baptize me with that name. She said that is not her name, and she has to be named Demetra or Demetra after my paternal grandmother,
Mm.
whose name was Dimitrula, and that's a sort of a diminutive and affectionate form
Mm.
of Demetra and the
Mm.
goddess Demeter. So I had a second birth certificate with that that name.
Mm.
And in looking at all of the asteroids, it turns out that the asteroid Margarita is conjunct my moon, which is the
Mm.
significator for mother, but that Demeter and Demetra, that's more recently an asteroid, or conjunct Saturn, who's the significator for father.
Mm.
And that Saturn was in my chart in the 12th house in Cancer. And during my early years, my parents lived with my grandmother, Dimitrula,
Mm.
and my father became quite ill shortly after I was born, and then he passed away when I was 3. So it was my grandmother who predominantly raised me. And when my father had died, of all of the children she had birthed, only one was still living.
Mm.
And so there was this immediate immersion um, as a very young child into the world of grief and loss of one's children, of being the context in which I came into the world. And then with my research, it turns out, genealogy research, that my grandmother's family came from Mantinea, which is in Arcadia, on the eastern edges of Arcadia. And
Mm.
that was an ancient cult site for the worship of Demeter.
Mm.
And so it was through really a paternal blood lineage that I had my earliest
Mm.
connections with the goddess.
Mm.
And then later in my life, when I was a brand new astrologer and went to my first conference, and this is a story I've told before publicly, um, I happened to be standing next to Eleanor Bach, who had just published the first asteroid Ephemeridis. She was kind enough to engage like a wide-eyed, like young astrologer who had no idea of a world that I had walked into. And she told me about her book. And when she heard my name was Demetra, which was my given name, she looked up in the ephemeris and saw that Ceres was opposite in the sun. And
Mm.
so she gave me a copy of her book
Mm.
because my name was Demetra, and Ceres, Demeter, was the goddess who had fueled her passion for discovering their positions.
Mm.
So that there's a very clear lineage of
Mm.
what holding that name has meant for me personally, and also in some ways, like how did I end up doing the asteroids? I think it all can is an
Mm.
unraveling of that particular ball of thread that does go through lifetimes.
Mm. Mm.
Oh, yeah. And that's interesting. So series even for Eleanor Bach was a guiding influence, like for
Yes, and okay, so one more little anecdote about Eleanor and Ceres is when I was in college, and I went to a college that was maybe 100 miles north of New York City,
Mm.
and I was aware of some um, very cool upperclassmen who were driving into New York City once a week to take astrology classes. And the word was they not only learned astrology, but the teacher fed them like these wonderful meals. And it was many years later that I realized that that teacher they were going to see was Eleanor Bach,
okay.
and that feeding her students was
Yeah.
part of her obsession with wanting to know where Ceres was and getting the ephemerides for them for the astrological world.
That's great. I feel like I remember you talking about, was it your grandmother? Somebody would read you, was
Yeah,
often reading you.
both of my grandmothers would tell me the stories of the Greek gods and goddesses as part of my bedtime stories.
Yeah, so they were very, very alive for you.
Mm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they were both immigrants. They had both been born in Greece and came
Mm.
to America in the early 1900s. And their reading skills in English at that time weren't great, but they knew the stories. And so they would tell me the stories in Greek. Um, and so those were always in the back of my mind,
Mm.
wondering like how or when I might ever tap into that and integrate it into what I was doing as an adult. So when I got the asteroid ephemeris, it was, oh, okay.
Mm.
Now those pieces also came together.
Mm. Mm.
Yeah, that was actually another one of our questions was asking you about that because that's Jason is one of my also favorite astrologers in terms of working with mythology and finding ways to bring that into astrological interpretation and meaning. And you were one of the first astrologers I came across that I really admired the way that you were doing that. And so one thing we were just curious of anything about your process of how you
Mm.
how you went about doing that, like your process, anything you could share about the process you kind of go through with like knowing the mythology and then coming across the astrology. And because I know all three of us are people that really believe the mythic meaning does have something to say about how astrology does actually work.
Well, when Eleanor gave me the Asteroid Goddess book, it was mostly ephemerides, some introduction, and she just had some key phrases of the mythology of each asteroid, like less than like paragraph or less of just like bullet phrases. Mm-hmm. But there was no interpretive what it meant in different signs and houses. And I got that book. At that time, I was living on a commune in the mountains of Southern Oregon, and I went back to that community, and I started putting the asteroids in the charts I was doing for the friends and other people who lived there. And because I didn't know what they meant in the signs and houses, and there was no book, I would simply tell the stories. I said, hey, I don't know what this means, but let me tell you the story. Can you relate? Does this make any sense to you? And I began to see very quickly eyes getting wide, mouths sort of going slack of you've just told me the story of my life. Mm-hmm. And seeing that what they had previously thought were unrelated incidents, when they heard them in a story, then all of that integrated into a sort of pattern that was underneath the unfoldment of specific events. And the incredible realization that the myths are so powerful and so eternal because, like in the Jungian context, they are the stories or play scripts that humanity has available through which to live our lives and to gain in consciousness. And that's how come they've survived, because these are stories. So there was beginning, the awareness that it worked that way. And then within probably 6 years or so after that, I met Tony Joseph. And I don't know if either of you have heard of him. He was he was my age, but he was one of the great voices and figures in the astrological community for working with archetypal myth. And he put on a number of brilliant conferences in San Francisco in the early 80s that I went to, where he had was interfacing with James Hillman and Stan Groff and people that Rick Tarnas would then eventually connect with. Tony was already bringing the archetypal mythological dimension into the astrological field. And got to be friends with him. And at one point I said to him, I said, so is it as simple that the asteroid just means what the myth means? And he said, yeah, it's that simple. I said, okay. And then that was part of the process of deciding I could begin to write Asteroid Goddesses. And I had been putting them in the charts at that point for about 10 years. And it's not only telling the story and seeing the response of the client, but over that period of time, because many of these people whose charts I was doing were my friends, this still wasn't in the place where I was a professional astrologer, and we certainly didn't have the internet to sort of harvest clients. I could see the stories unfold over the years of their lives. And that was an important piece of confirming the theoretical process. So one of my close friends has a Ceres conjuncture ascendant. And when she was young, she had a child from her first marriage. And then during her second marriage, they were on a camping trip and the van caught on fire and the child died. And
Mm.
so there's like the initial series and the loss of child. Then with her second husband, they discovered that he was unable to have children. So she had the the dread of having the nurturing impulse with the Baroness. And through magical sequence of like out of the box events, they were able to adopt a child in the similar way that Ceres, when she was sitting by the well, the
Mm.
princesses said, "Hey, we need a nursemaid for our brother." And so then she became the foster parent for the young prince. Yeah. Then, because like she was the Ceres person, she loved to garden, she loved to cook, she was obsessed with food, with
Mm.
had a home bakery. Then that turned into a little business where she was making sweets and selling them all over Eugene in the early days of the hippie businesses. And then with her interest in food, she became inspired to become a nutritional counselor. So she
Mm.
did those courses, started to see clients, and it turned out that most of her clients, their food issues were related to eating disorders.
Mm.
And so we have the connection of the inability to take in food of anorexia or to keep it in with bulimia.
Yeah.
And so we have like whole food complex issue that's part of Ceres. And then she discovers that many of these women who had eating disorders had been the victims of early sexual or emotional abuse as children.
Yeah.
So then that brings us into Persephone's abduction and violation.
Mm.
And so as her counseling went on, she went back to school yet again and got a master's in social work and therapy. And in the last couple of decades, she specialized in therapy for abused children and for children whose parents are going through divorces and custody battles. And
Mm.
so we have the full spectrum of the myth of Ceres and Pluto, like fighting over who gets to have Persephone, and the
Mm.
mother's rage at the violation of her daughter, and how they both develop eating issues as a result of that trauma. And
Mm.
it goes all the way through. So in one life,
Mm.
you see so many of the different themes all unfold in accordance with the myth. And you go, okay, like this stuff works.
Mhm.
I feel like that's sort of your experience too, Jason. I mean, you were a therapist for so many years, and besides being an astrologer, right, and talking to people about the myths, the same kind of thing, right? Just seeing
Yeah,
all these types of things showing up.
for sure. I think one of the advantages of working with the goddess asteroids, because I also have my own vivid memory of discovery of your book, and having it handed to me. We had a little astrology. We've had many astrology forums come and go in Santa Fe, as they do everywhere. And another therapist, Leslie Nathanson, here in town, who's a really great astrologer too. She gave me a copy of Asteroid Goddesses, and I remember what I felt was just like there was this freedom, maybe because these have not yet been thoroughly disciplined and rationalized in the astrology tradition. There was a freedom to be a storyteller that it kind of gave me. Like I'm allowed to just tell a story. I don't have to delineate or, follow
Uh-huh.
anything. And I can just tell a story. And I mean, just in quotes. And then, of course, the way the contours of the person would identify back would start to elaborate the house and the sign, and you'd see which part of the hologram of the myth came forward. But that's exactly that. I love that Tony said that to you. Yep, that's it. Because I really feel that. I and it was so. liberating, to be allowed to do. For me, that was a huge part of my professional development as an astrologer, was being sort of given this capacity and then seeing that it still carries through to meaningful delineation. It isn't, a random share at all. It's actually you can really find it there. So that's part of why we asked that question about how you see the mythic and the astrological, because I think people need to feel what is, method in that sense, that there is rigor to this method. It isn't just willy-nilly tell the story. There's actually, we observe the patterns and we see how they play in different people's lives. And I could feel that in your book even then, right? Reading it, it's like, oh, these are not just speculations, right? They're actually based on them. So it's really interesting to hear the story and the kind of longitudinal study you got to do in people's lives. Yeah.
Yeah, it really makes sense that that was so connected into actual experiential understanding of not just putting the myths to series, but seeing how it really was showing up, and then over time, so seeing like a whole across a whole lifetime, even and a number of years of people that you really knew. Yeah,
And Jason, like, oh, both of you know the power of telling stories,
Mm,
that hearing the story doesn't, I mean, we hear the story with our mind, and some people are taking notes, but in the actual telling of the story, and particularly when you tell it and you're in a live interaction with someone, the story goes to some other layer or level in, excuse me, in the being.
mm,
Somewhere like where the Greeks would call like the thumos, or in
mm,
the belly.
yeah,
And there's this like emotional feeling and connection.
mm,
And that's where the real awareness of what the relevance
mhm,
of this story is in my own life. That's where it starts bringing forth the awareness and the connection. It's
mm.
like, oh, you have Ceres in the second house. It's like, oh, you value food, or some keyword, like, juxtaposition of phrases, like, yeah, maybe I do, but so what? It's like
Right.
very different when there's that taking in of the story on that deeper level.
Yeah, and when you're with the person too, like the way you tell the story will be different in that moment, right? Like just like for the Greeks, they told the story differently in different places and at different times.
And and that's, I'm glad you brought that up, because myth was fluid.
Yeah.
It was like the creative clay of the potter. And
Mm,
so each playwright or vase painter had the freedom to
mm,
interpret the myth in a particular way that they wanted to. So you have all these different versions of the myth, but that ability to continue to be creative with the myths still exists up to this very day. And there's a part of the myth that is recognizable to everyone,
yeah.
regardless of the variation. And then the variations are appropriate to time and place and
Mm,
teller and hearer and all of that. And
mm,
so we also, as mythic storytellers in our field,
mm,
need to feel okay with um, our ability to be creative
mhm, mm,
in the telling of the stories.
yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And of course, Ceres or and Demeter. This is a very powerful mythic story that was we'll get into a little bit more. Is connected with the mysteries that Eleusis. That I mean, how millions of people probably. I don't know how many. I mean, it's like thousands every year participating in this for a really long time. Um, but I really love that idea of the fluidity, and that really gets into a lot of stuff with astrology, with old text and more modern ideas of like certain keywords and what you're sort of thinking something is going to mean ahead of time, but then there's also sort of that divinatory or intuitive moment of being in the space with the person and what's alive in the field around you, because these myths are multivalent. There's all sorts of directions that you could potentially go, and there's a whole thing about how do you, and the way you tell that story could potentially change, just the way people, they tell their own life story in different ways at different times. And is there anything, I mean, I think one of the questions we thought about asking was, any particular mythic themes that you feel like really get at the heart of Ceres. But I know also asking that question, it's like there's so many, it's just a real rich depth of, places that you can go with her story and myth. But are there any in particular that you feel like are some of the real key ones in particular that tend to show up?
Well, I alluded to it a little bit. I think that it's the power of food,
Mm.
the power of food. And she was known for having given the gift of agriculture to humanity so people could have a stable and secure food supply. And then part two of her story is the loss of her child and her immobilizing grief, where she herself was unable to eat.
Right.
And therefore, all of the food that would otherwise grow to feed the people of the earth, that couldn't grow either, because the divine source of, I don't know if you want to call it life or energy, that made the plants grow was deadened
Mm.
due to the grief. And so the people started starving.
Mm.
And it wasn't until some sort of deal was made whereby she could have her child back again. And meanwhile, Persephone, who was as a child was traumatized, being violated and imprisoned in the underworld, she couldn't eat either. So there's the association with the inability to nurture,
Mm.
being a response to grief and trauma and fear. And it wasn't until she came back that plants could start growing again. And so when we take that to the core, is a child's first awareness of being loved is through being fed, right? As soon as the child comes out with a mother's body, it starts like pursing its lips, looking for a source of sustenance.
Mm.
And when it receives that food, either through the breast or through the bottle, the child goes, oh, okay, like I'm being fed. I'm worthy enough to be kept alive. Someone cares enough about me to keep me alive by feeding me. And
Mm.
so the fundamental connection between food is equal to love.
Mm.
And all of that means in terms of developing a sense of not only self-worth and self-esteem, but then the ability to give that to another, all comes back to that primal relationship of Ceres and food.
Mm.
And then, well, everything else sort of unfolds from that place. So as I thought about that question, I go, okay, like what's the seminal moment, okay, of this story is like food is love and keeps one alive.
Mm. Yeah, that's really, I think that's really good, because I mean, there's so many different ways you can go with how she shows up, and those are like a number of things that you brought up in your book too, and you can get into even like attachment patterns with the parents and
Oh yeah.
all sorts of different psychological dimensions. But yeah, I can see how that's a good way to kind of read it into that fundamental.
And all the crazy things we do to our kids over food. It's like,
Hmm.
oh, you've been like a bad child, you have to go to bed without dinner.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Or, oh, if you promise to be good, we'll give you dessert. And of using food as a reward or punishment for good or bad behavior,
Mhm.
and the denial of food and the terror that that strikes in the young child.
Mhm.
That,
It's also, yeah, there's something about rooting it with food. I mean, as you said that, it feels, with something with planets, the instincts they carry or the instincts they symbolize, and somehow just saying food, nourishment, anchors it in a bodily way, which I feel is a very Ceres thing to do, to really say, don't make it just images and symbols, let's get really fundamental. And I really appreciate that one thing that happens is I feel hungry now. But I think that's the point, I feel hungry. And even that question of how do you respond to hunger? Like, do you ignore it? Do you overeat? Do you get angry at people because you haven't eaten? I mean, it just immediately opens up all sorts of routes and all sorts of earlier templates about, yeah, did mother just let you cry yourself to sleep, or did they come and tend you? So I actually think that's a really powerful, just a root for the archetype. I really, yeah, that feels really alive, and it does. It feels so connected because I've always been so taken that the two gifts, agriculture and the mysteries, and that these are somehow unified in this archetype. Like it's not, flesh and spirit separate. She gives both. And yeah, the food route feels, yeah, just so basic, and yet basic means fundamental.
yeah.
Yeah.
And then like all the different diets and
Right.
food preferences and
Mm,
food sensitivities and food allergies and
right.
food craziness,
Mm,
um, that some have to be careful here not to go off on the offensive. But we only have that luxury in very privileged cultures that we can be so picky about our food.
yeah,
And in
the preciousness of it all. Yeah.
other cultures where any kind of food is like total blessing.
Mm. It's making me think too of like the Ceres Pluto,
Mm.
relationship, of course, mythically, but also in that I was just at a retreat in Provence, and which is a food place,
Yeah.
and we have an amazing chef, Selena, who I mean, she's just completely working with Ceres, Demeter, but I really, the retreat is very depth oriented, and really, we literally go down into the caves, like the prehistoric caves, um, and I had the very clear knowing, though, that Selena is the co-leader of the retreat. Like we're doing the mysteries, she's doing the food, and there's not one without the other. Or if there is, it's not as rich, let's say, because it was so utterly fundamental again to have that. That level of support. It's resourcing. In trauma work, you would say, don't ever go to the trauma without resourcing. And Ceres is often a place I see where resourcing is a big story there. And then as a metaphor in there, resource, to, you know, come back to your source, mother. Yeah. It's really the other thing I was going to say too is I did work a lot with eating disorders, and pretty much invariably there's a Ceres story. I've very much have uh, found that to be the case, and actually sometimes that metaphor unlocks a lot for people. That story, it does change how they relate to it because they see it's part of a bigger story.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Mm. What is that? Does that go into the mystery part at all, or how do you see that? How does it help them? What parts of the story do you feel like help them
Well, I think
start
that
to reframe
well,
it?
well, yeah, I mean, I mean, no eating disorder is in a vacuum, right? So it has there's a story in it. And it's often like, I mean, people who are purging food often need to purge something like they were given poison, metaphorically, right? They're given bad food or and they need to get it out. Or they grew up with deprivation or they need to control things. The anorexia story is often about control. Any of these eating issues, they're always, to me at least, I mean, there's a way of looking at a symptom that's just about, okay, this isn't normal, let's get it back to normal. But then there's like Jung's question, which is, what is the symptom a symbol of? What's the soul or what's the person trying to communicate, or how is it something there? And so the myth, to me, it's just like what Demetra was saying, that eating disorders so often have often a sexual abuse of some form, or certainly attachment issues, just not getting the care we need, or being over controlled, or not enough structure. So the myth is this way of telling the story that connects the symptom to the personal history, like the archetypal field gives that context that the person can make the connections. And it also, honestly, it makes it a little bit less personal and a little more, it gives you some freedom from just a,
Yeah,
classic trauma narrative. You begin to see it as a bigger story that we're all working out together.
right. That's so important that eating disorders are a cause of great shame for many people.
Right.
You have to keep it like really, because no one can know.
Hmm.
And people think it's their own personal weird aberration.
Yeah.
And when they begin to see, not only is it something that other people have, but it's part of a universal story that people through all time have had, then as they enter into the larger story of what their life meaning is, there's such a release
Hmm.
of personal shame
Hmm. Yeah.
that is layered on top of whatever it was that happened to
Mm.
cause the disorder to begin with.
Yeah, that is really good the way you just said that. Yeah, because I feel that too. We usually say with those types of things that you can't even make progress on the issue until the shame layer can be peeled back enough. Otherwise, it just keeps, shame has this encapsulating quality that it keeps something isolated, it keeps it from any change. And the myth is often enough for the shame to loosen up at least enough that other choices become possible. And actually participation with the myth, being able to do your own grieving like Ceres had to do, being able to negotiate for the release of your inner child, internally with your own parts, to insist that they be freed. All of that can happen, but I really am glad you named the shame because I think that myth is a great antidote to shame. That's a really good thing for people to really understand about it.
And then also the power of myth, especially the Persephone story, is you look at a chart. I look at a chart and I see a prominent Persephone or Proserpina. And I don't want to come out and say, like, were you violated or abused as a child? Like, it's an astrologer, like, it's like, that is not a cool thing to just say, hi, welcome to the reading. But if you simply say, okay, you've got this mythic figure at a prominent place, and this is the story. And then you say, is there anything in the story that you can relate to?
Yeah.
And then if they're ready to share or acknowledge that,
Mm,
then you give them a space to open up
mm,
and listen.
yeah.
And if they're not, and there are many, many reasons people have for not,
Yeah.
then you can move on
Yeah.
and do some other part of the chart and a piece of the counseling, the wisdom aspect of counseling, especially for one-time readings when you're not in ongoing therapy, is you don't want to stir up more then you're able to help them process and integrate. You don't want to stir up this whole thing and then send them out the door.
Absolutely.
And so there has to be great sensitivity of how one approaches really sensitive issues. And
Yeah.
myth is a wonderful, like, first step to
Mm.
testing the waters, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah,
Mm.
otherwise you, the astrologer, become Pluto abducting the
Right,
client
right,
into
exactly.
into a situation that they're not
Right,
equipped for. Yeah.
yeah.
Mm. And you had mentioned Pluto a little earlier, Jason. Is there anything about just the relationship between Pluto and Ceres? I mean, one of the things we were also going to just ask also is just the
Yeah.
reclassification that's happened in the past 25 years. I guess it was roughly 20 or so years ago that it happened, that Pluto went from being considered a planet to being reclassified as a dwarf planet. And Ceres, for really many great reasons, because she's really not like any of the asteroids. She's spherical. You know, at this point, they're pretty sure she has water.
Yeah.
She has like these ice volcanoes, which are like really amazing and evocative of this Persephone Hades realm. Um, so now she becomes reclassified as a dwarf planet, and so they become these two dwarf planets. Ceres, a dwarf planet, sort of in this realm of like between Mars and Jupiter. Pluto's obviously the dwarf planet, kind of lord of that Kuiper Belt region. But yeah, anything just about your thoughts about that dwarf planet connection they have now, and just anything else about what else that says about them and their relational dynamic.
Um, yeah, that makes me smile. I say, ancient justice has been done. And Ceres was, she was the mother archetype of both the upper world and the lower world. Both
Mm.
realms were under her domain.
Mm.
And there's an interesting version of her story that was told by Charlene Spretnik in Lost Goddesses of Early Greece. Ceres and Persephone were going around nurturing the new sprouts that were coming up. And as Persephone bent down to coax it, she heard all of this moaning and all this noise under the earth. And she said, Mother, like, what's going on down there? There's all this moaning and wailing, like. And Ceres says, oh, those are the cries of the dead. And Persephone said, well, isn't anyone taking care of them? Whose job is that anyway?
Mm.
Ceres says, well, it's actually my job, but I'm so busy taking care of the living. I just don't have time to tend to
Mm.
the dead.
Mm.
And so Persephone then decides to make a voluntary descent
Mm.
to be the caretaker of the underworld realm. Okay. Then you have Zeus or Jupiter fighting his war with his father, Kronos, Saturn, and winning, and then divvying up the world to his siblings, mostly to his brothers. And so he gives the seas to Poseidon, Neptune, and he gives the underworld to Hades, Pluto. And Pluto says, okay, now the underworld is mine, but it's not going to be such an easy job to lay claim to it
Mm.
because Ceres is like, she's got an iron grip on life and death. He says, if I abduct her daughter and marry her, then
Mm.
that will give me the legal claim to the underworld realm. And so it was through the abduction of Persephone that Pluto was able to become, in fact, the ruler of the underworld. And this is a custom that has continued for millennia, is that um, in indigenous rural cultures, if a man like envies the farm of one of his neighbors and wants it, if he is able to violate the daughter that belongs to this person who owns the farm, then she is honor bound to marry him, and then the farm becomes his. So this is not only a mythological story, but it was a practice that was enacted for many thousands of years and still is enacted today in certain parts of the world. And so Pluto gets the underworld as his domain through a kind of underhanded or illegal act. And so I thought when he got demoted and Ceres got promoted from asteroid to dwarf planet, and he got knocked down from planet to dwarf planet, the scales of justice have brought balance into that relationship.
Mm. Mm.
Well, another area we haven't fully gone into yet is her bringing of the mysteries. And, one of the things that's interesting about related to food is that even, people participating in the mysteries would be fasting, right? There's a whole process going on with that leading into the mysteries. But then there's also this giving then of this spiritual nourishment, or when you're bringing up before fears of death, and we don't know exactly what happened, but all three of us have been to that site and in Eleusis or Elefsina, and had really powerful contact with the land there. I know one of my personal feelings of being there was actually a sense of something about death, and the sense of overcoming the fear of death. Definitely there's something about that I really did sense being there. But yeah, how are some ways that how do you feel this mystery element of her then starts coming in with how she shows up with the astrology?
One of the ways I've seen Ceres manifest is with people who not only have experienced a lot of loss in their lives through the death of loved ones. Like for all of us, someone's going to die that we love, chances are. So that in itself is not out of the realm of the ordinary. But certain people experience much more death of loved ones than others. And then and within that, as in Ceres can be a signature of that, is ending up in the role of being an attendant to the dying. And we see people who end up doing hospice work professionally, or volunteer work, or simply are the ones that are there when their family members die. They're the ones that go sit at the deathbed and take care of the bodies afterwards and make the arrangements and hold the space of mourning. Wow. And so we have the ancient archetype of the funerary priestess.
Mm.
And for those Ceres individuals, I think it doesn't have to be explicit levels, but on energetic levels, they're there holding the hands of the dying, being present in the room, giving them that sustenance and nourishment. And there's someone here with me, helping me go through this most momentum moment of life, which is the absence of life. And so and you talked about what you're doing here is the twilight planets of holding the upper and lower world. It can also be the Ceres individuals and the Persephone who are there helping people make that transition literally, or then also psychologically as shamanic healers and also as psychotherapists, helping people move into the underworld and find the spark of life to lead them back out of being reborn. So it can also operate on that level. So I think that's one place where Ceres and the mysteries in very real life ways can make itself manifest in the chart.
Mm.
But as we were speaking, I also thinking about the mysteries, thought about another thing I wanted to mention. And the high point of the mysteries was you've read like showing a single ear of grain. Do you
Hmm.
remember that piece when
Hmm.
you read like what happens? And it's like from the dark soil, like new life is born again. The
Hmm.
plant comes, sprouts again, and it
Mm.
starts its life cycle.
Mm.
And I remember when my um, mom passed away, um, and she had a sense that she was dying. And she had said to my sister, who was living with her, she said, make sure, like on the 40th day after my death, that you go to the church and they do this ritual. Like, don't forget to do that.
Mm.
She was insistent.
Mm.
And my sister, who was raised in a different religion, because of she was my half sister and part of the marriage agreement, was like, oh yeah, like, oh, I'm so busy, I'm not going to get that together. So I said, okay, like, I'll take care of it. And I went to my local Greek Orthodox church and I said, hey, is it possible to arrange for the service to be done for my mother? And
Mm.
I put them in touch with our home church so that they knew it was like a legitimate request. And then what I had to make for the service was this bowl of coliva. And it took me 3 days to make it. I had to buy all these like wheat berries and boil them like for like 24 hours and then spread them out on towels for a couple of days and let them dry and then mix them with pomegranate seeds and sesame seeds
Hmm.
and all kinds of other berries and honey into this whole thing and then make a beautiful arrangement out of it and bring that to the church.
Mm.
And it was the seeds of life in honor for the dead
Hmm.
that would facilitate their eternal memory
Mm.
of being a piece of the ceremony. So we see in a very literal way the grain of seed being shown and how they weren't Greek Orthodox in 1500 BC, but the Greek culture kept elements of the ancient Hellenic rituals and folded them into the new religion. And the seeds of life in honor of the dead was one piece of it. And this is a very serious
Mm.
image in terms of the mysteries.
Yeah, it's a beautiful image and like image of cyclical time also, that
Yeah.
the
Hmm.
seasons are start to happen and uh wow, that's a gorgeous image. It also is a reminder when you're speaking, about the way that like how it is when we are in Greece and there's a church often where the
Hmm.
other site was, where the other site was, and I remember on my first trip to Greece, well, I've been to Greece before, but in many ways, the first trip to Greece was with you and Brian, and uh, and one of the things that you shared with us right from the beginning was, it's not about the building, it's about the spot. The spot is the thing. That's where they could feel the God, or they could and in
Hmm.
a way, the building is almost just a reminder, like here's the spot, and a way to honor that. And so when you're speaking about the pomegranate, all those different elements still going through, uh, and it you can just feel even more nourishment from it because of
Yeah.
how old it is. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
really. There was another story that you just caught. I always, one of the things we were speaking about in our Twilight class is just the moment of astrology. We have them looking at Geoffrey Cornelius notions, and that we're in that right now, though, that oracular moment, right, where you're telling the story and then it stimulates something in me that I've never looked at the same way. So a person in my life who was who was really like a mother, but as I now am
Hmm.
reflecting, I'm thinking it's the Ceres mother, not the moon mother. She was sort of fostered me. I was a sort of demophon, I think, with her. Uh, and we met when I was, 16, and I only knew her at our shared Saturn return. We were a, generation, Saturn generation. And she died, she began to die, and I moved in and took care of her for the last few months of her life. And two things came to mind that I've honestly never put together until right now. One is her Ceres is on my her Ceres was Neptune was right on my Sun Pluto conjunction
Wow.
natally, so her Ceres right at my Sun. And then when she was dying, it was when transiting Pluto was on my Ceres. Again, very exact. And the way I have often told that story is that what I saw, she had many, many people who loved her and came, and all of them kind of wanted to go into that story of like, oh, you're gonna get through this, and stay alive, and it was, just they just don't want to look at that. And I noticed that I was not afraid to walk with her, in the dying, and not aggressively, but just to be present and really walk through that mystery, which was profound and was the moment that I was like, oh, I'm able to do this. And that's when I knew I would become a therapist right then. It was during that process. It was like I'm able to do this. And that was a Pluto, Pluto on my Ceres. So yeah, thank you. I'm just moved to share it partly so people see how this even works, right? Like you're sharing the story and
Right.
something comes forward, Yeah, yeah. Really beautiful thing. Yeah.
Mm. That process of the mysteries you were just mentioning, the seasons, that's something we've been talking in the we've done one class so far with series. So we have to say, I mean, we started with like 4 classes on Mercury, then we went through 4 classes with Chiron, which really lived up to what you might imagine would happen. It's the first time I think maybe both of us have taught first time I've taught a extended course on Chiron, and it
Hmm.
really went there. And so I think maybe everyone was ready to go right into this. The first week of series, I was like, wow, this is
Yeah.
really extremely potent. Just what came out of the very first class where people already were relating with her. And been talking about this. So like with the death rebirth of the grain or the corn, and that through this death and rebirth, and or this is also how the seasons come in, any kind of cyclical movement, or this way perhaps series is helping with processing, whether that's grief or loss or just being embodied, this sense of being embodied, being incarnate, being here in this world where this is a necessity that we are going to, like that Ananke experience. But then there's also how does she put us back in touch with like life, or even I guess you could say eros even. There's also like movement even, and like how that the well at the mysteries, where on one hand you could say it's where she came to grieve, but I know the actual ancient term was like the well of the beautiful dances, and it's thought perhaps people were dancing around that well as part of the mysteries. So again, again that's got a cyclical, like they're kind of we don't, I mean they might have been dancing and circumambulating this well. Yeah, I don't know if anything about any of that news either of you to comment on. That's something that's sort of definitely come up already. Like, how do you go through these experiences, or like you're just describing, being with somebody through um, death and release, but then there's like she seems very much part of like the return. Like, how do you return and into life and everything?
The question is, how does one return after a
Mm.
huge loss?
Mm-hmm.
And I think I remember in reading about her that they spoke of accepting a time of lying fallow
Hmm.
and that being okay. and that farmers know after like they've planted certain fields a couple of years in a row, then they have to give that field a break for a few years before they replant it again so it can regenerate itself.
Mm.
And I think that that is traditionally what in ritual they say that people should take some months of mourning the loss of a loved one where they're relatively withdrawn, that they don't go out, that they're not expected to pick up their life immediately, that there's the wearing of black as a symbol
Mm.
that one is in mourning, and for other people to be respectful
Mm.
of that space. I because there's a piece of us that after a loved one dies, that we are energetically living in the underworld with them for a period of time. And I remember after my granddaughter passed away, like then I'd be out, let's say in the grocery store, and I'd see like everyone else like chatting and putting stuff in their baskets and doing their thing. And I felt, yeah, I see all of this, but I'm not there in that same realm with them, even though I am. Like there's some other space that I'm in. And so that's part of that mourning period or the transition period. And I think that as astrologers, we can help our clients understand when they have Ceres prominent or they've had Ceres transits wherever, that it's okay for a period of time for nothing to be happening. You don't feel inspired. You're not excited about anything. You feel like you just don't want to do anything. And our culture, of course, doesn't tolerate that very well.
Mm.
Um, but that is one of her teachings,
Mm.
is to just relax, not even relax. I mean, I don't know how relaxing it is to be in the morning space, but to give oneself permission to be there.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's a denial of that, then that often becomes the seeds of all kinds of other weird things like maturing in the future, of not giving oneself the time to grieve a loss.
Yeah.
And so that's part of the seasonal story, that
Mm-hmm.
the, you know, in the
Yeah.
winter, the earth lies fallow.
Yeah. Yeah, that word productivity, they talk about
Yeah,
productivity culture
right.
and the idea that the field is not asked to be productive constantly.
Yeah,
It's given that period of rest. Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
I remember being raised by both of my grandmothers as a young child, and they wore black all the time, and all their friends wore black. And part of the custom was like when someone dies, depending on how close the relative is, like a husband dies, you wear black for 15 years. A child dies, it's 10 years. A brother, it's 7 years. And these periods couldn't be consecutive.
Mhm.
Right? I mean, couldn't be simultaneous. Like you had to add them one onto the other.
Uh,
So for many of them, like there were, black dresses, the black stockings, the black shoes, the black pocketbooks, the black umbrellas. It
That's-
was like my childhood is filled with images of mourning women. And so
Wow.
that's another series piece of my own images that somewhere along the line have helped to
Mm.
lead to this work.
Mm.
mm. Well, one thing we were also going to ask you about is, traveling to Greece and leading sacred tours through sacred sites. As Jason mentioned, was that 2011 that y'all were on that together? Perhaps I'm trying to remember because I remember
I think
talking.
that was it.
Yeah, it was a
Like,
25-year anniversary of the Asteroid Goddess book being published. Because it was called an
Yeah,
homage to the Asteroid Goddesses.
right. Yeah,
Yeah,
we
yeah,
did that.
Yeah, because I actually
It
met
was
Jason
published
and
in 86. Yeah.
I'm pretty sure it's 2011 because I met Jason in person not long after he came
Yeah,
back from that at a conference, and he actually had a little vial of water from where Demeter had bathed herself, and where you're like,
from the Ladonis
you
River.
were
Yeah.
like, would you like
Yeah.
some of this water? Anoint me with some of this water. I was like, yes, I want some. Um, yeah, and so last year we led a group through sites, and we were able to take a group through Eleusis. But I know you've done this many times, and just wondering what you could share with people about. I mean, there's just real. It's hard to. It's really sort of an indescribable thing of what it's like to be fascinated by this mythology and the stories and 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 how they've released astrology, and then to actually be there in the land and in the place. Anything about your experiences of going there that you'd like to share, and how that comes into your relationship with her?
Right. Well, my first trip to Greece was in September of 1989. And a friend of a friend who I had met was leading a small group of 7 people. And so it was a time in my life where I could go, and I did go. And that was my first trip to Eleusis. And I was aware at that time that Pluto was exactly conjunct my IC.
Mm.
And I was thinking, oh, what's going to happen to me when I go to Greece? Like, am I going to come back? Am I fall into some sort of pit into the underworld? And and that trip, it was all fine. And in the, I came home, and that whole period is like, hey, Pluto on the IC, like, shouldn't something have happened that I didn't see any outer event? But what did happen was that my friend Michael Meyer, who he and I were on the trip, and about 2/3 of the way through, we looked at each other, and we were both into myth and astrology. And we said, hey, we could do this. And so we did. And during that first trip, Pluto was on the IC, and Ceres was conjunct my moon. And I went back to September of that year and found those correlations last night. So in retrospect, that initiated a whole then decades of doing sacred site travel to Greece. And that to me was fascinating, to understand Pluto on an angle in that context of what it can stir up and initiate without it being a catastrophic external event in the moment. So in was in 1992 that I led the first trip that I did. And that's the photo that I sent you.
Yeah, do you want
Um,
me to pull it up?
yeah.
Let's
And
see here.
at that time, and this is right in front of in the cave of Pluto that's on the site.
Yeah.
And Pluto was squaring the degree of my ascendant by this point. So once again, we have, and there, so that's why I wanted to show it. And here I am in Pluto's cave at Eleusis. This is my partner, and he has his son conjunct Persephone, and I have a Ceres opposite my sun, and then Demeter conjunct a Saturn that's in a conjunction with the sun. So it's a classic photo of having the signatures natally in one's chart, and then going to, and then they're being activated, and then going to the site and experiencing the energies. And as a Persephone child, he had his own very Persephone story. So one of the things that then developed as I led other sacred trips was finding the asteroids in people's charts that were prominent And when we went to the sites that were either named after that asteroid or the deities to whom it was sacred, to tell them, hey, this is your site. And that when you go there, make an especial point to give offerings, make prayers, go into a meditative place, ask for healing and forgiveness, be generous in your spiritual energy for the benefit of others. Use this profound opportunity for healing and spiritual practice because you have a direct energetic connection with the place. And so that's one way that I began to understand the whole idea of reframing the mysteries in a modern context
Mhm.
when people go to the sites. And as you discovered, we really can't do ritual on the site. It's like you can't like get in a circle and hold hands and start singing that the guards are going to blow whistles and come over like shooing you away. So that in most places, and I want to close with a story where we
Mm.
got permissions to actually do that. Um, but that uh, this was, you asked me, like, what was my connection with the trips and the mysteries, and how did I try to put that together? And this is just a response to that.
Well, yeah, we definitely had a very powerful experience too. And yeah, we were noticing that for sure. Lots of people having their own sort of personal mysteries
Right.
and journeys and synchronicities. It was pretty amazing to experience just well, I had experience first kind of traveling on my own with my partner, which was really powerful, but then joining up with a group and being on this group tour, Jason would lead these dream groups in the morning sometimes where then people were even sort of sharing dreams. And there was this whole sort of even collective group dynamic that started happening of shared experiences and meaning, but then people are also really on their own personal journeys. And like you were saying, you would then get the opportunity, for example, like Epidaurus and being at the Asclepian sanctuary. And a lot of people had really powerful experiences there in relation to like Asclepius, for example. But it could happen at all the sites, right? Or at Eleusis
Right.
or
Especially, this
yeah.
site is your site. But if you're an
Yeah.
astrologer based on your chart, this is your place.
Yeah.
That it gives it a, an extra amount of potency for your own personal um, issues and situations and destiny.
Right. And sense of self, yeah, and sense of destiny. Exactly. I
Yeah.
think I'm thinking of a couple of moments at a couple of these places where it's as if, people meet themselves as if for the first time, because in that spot the frequency, the resonance act, they feel the resonance of the story, and then usually some event happens around them, and they're suddenly in the myth, and then when they're in the myth, it all, shifts. We were saying to them, and for astrologers, to go to Greece is to go to the land of your gods. We say these words every day. We say Pluto, we say, and Roman names, but we are speaking of these gods woven into this landscape the way they're, woven into the sky. And it's, it's really unbelievable what can happen there. And I think Eleusis in particular, invites that, given how many times that story was being told there and shown there. And for our work we were doing, yeah, the dream work, and sometimes like psychodrama or astrodrama stuff, which is part of the story there also, performing the myth. And so it really is almost yeah, but like you say, it's a heightened opportunity for participation.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Direct participation
yeah,
with your uh, divine energies, entities,
yeah,
angels, guides, deities that surround you and live in your psychic space,
yeah.
meeting them and communicating with them, that the doors of perception become wide open.
Mm.
Yeah,
Hmm.
definitely. And a
And I,
really,
you
and
know,
really,
yeah. And I feel like, uh, Gray, I did want to speak to the very last question that
yeah.
you have here. Um, and you might ask it, and then I'll respond of what happened, uh, in Demeter's Mysteries in Arcadia.
Yeah, we can talk about. So there's the Eleusinian mysteries, which are what most people think about her and her stories, but then there are also the Arcadian mysteries. And actually, you are the two people I've ever heard give talks talking about this. I remember actually, I guess it was after the trip you had gone with Jason.
Yeah.
You were at this conference in Oregon. You gave a talk on Ceres, um, and that I was at. That was actually the first astrology conference I was ever at. That was and you talked on Ceres and talked about the Arcadia myth. And I know Jason's done work also on that Arcadian myth as in your own work as another way of approaching Ceres. And so this is the part of the story where she's really wandering in Arcadia, and then like her Persephone is violated by Pluto. This happens to her with Poseidon, and she turns into a horse as part of that, I guess, sort of pursuit. And then there's a daughter, is it Despoina? How do you say it? Which is not really her name, but it's like she's like it's what you can, I guess, refer to her as. She's like an unspeakable name, and then there's a magical horse
Yeah.
that's also born. But then there are these, and also then she goes secludes herself in a cave instead of a temple, right? Right, and it's Pan that comes to her and is mediating it, and then the fates are involved, and she also purifies herself in the river. So there's a whole nother version of the story and how we get to the mysteries. Yeah, yeah. So that was one of the things we wanted to hear. Your experience there, and also leading groups to that place in contrast to Eleusis.
Yeah, I mean, for me, that's when I felt I actually had a, vi- a visitation from the goddess,
Mm.
was in Arcadia.
Mm.
And Ceres' other daughter, whom is not spoken about, had a sacred site, a temple, and a place of worship called Lycusura. It was in the middle of Arcadia. And in the trip that Brian and I arranged, we really wanted to go there. And our travel agent tried to dissuade us. She says, "Oh, it's really hard to get to. It's a closed site. You can't go in there. There's this other place that's much prettier, and we're going to take you there instead." And Brian and I said, "No, no, no, we want to go there." And she said, "You can't get into the site." We said, "We don't care. We'll just look at it through the fence. Like that'll be okay." Because what? It's not the building, it's the land. We just wanted to be there. So we had to persevere to get our way in that situation. And indeed, the way we went, it was a treacherous bus ride of mountain roads that were all dirt with sheer precipices and no guardrails. And we're looking at each other like, oh no, like, what do we get our people into here? But after some time, we do arrive there. And in fact, there's a big fence around it, and there's a padlock on the fence. And we're going, okay, well, we knew this would be the case. And then we begin to get off the bus, and suddenly there appears this woman.
Yeah.
She's an elderly woman.
Very
Her hair
elderly.
was silver and was sort of caught up in this cascade on top of her head. And she had a staff, and she was accompanied by 50 goats that all had bells on them. And she had been singing
Uh,
to them. And
yeah.
she's radiant, glowing.
Yeah.
And she starts speaking in Greek to our bus driver. And she makes this thing with her hands like, And so the bus driver said, she's told you to jump over the fence
Right.
to get in. And she said, but don't go near the museum building because there's a camera there and it'll set off an alarm. So stay away from that. So, like, we're getting permission
Right.
to go into the sacred precinct that's locked. So, Brian does jump over the fence. He goes around the perimeter and he finds a place where the bottom of the fence isn't so anchored to the ground. He lifts it up and he directs all of us to where it is, and we all crawl under the fence on the ground on our bellies. And he's holding up this wire fence so it doesn't catch us and hurt us. And we all go into the precinct and we walk around and we look at stuff and we realize we're all by ourselves, so we can do ritual there. And
Yeah.
much of the ritual would happen spontaneously where we go, oh, yeah, we could do it here. And we all said, yeah, this is the spot. And we
Mm,
start collecting things to make a
mm,
altar with the local rocks and
mm,
things. And the woman, the goddess, she begins to walk around the perimeter
mm,
of the site with her goats,
mm,
Hmm.
tinkling bells,
mm,
and she is singing.
mm.
And she keeps up the song and the circumambulation for about 45 minutes as we go into
Wow.
our meditation
Mhm.
space. And
Yeah.
then as we sort of like collectively come out of it, the song dies down and then she disappears into wherever it was she
Mhm.
went to. And I look back on that moment as being one of the most profoundly sacred experiences I had there, where there was the manifestation of the deity who
Yeah.
gave us permission to pay respects in a very secret site of Demeter and Desponia that most tourists no longer have the opportunity to get to,
Yeah.
and many like never have been there. So that's like one of the treasures in my heart that I hold. And
Mhm.
it was so wonderful that Jason, that you and I were able to experience that together, and sort of our link with this work and what you're doing now of carrying some of the ideas, some of the stuff that Brian and I like had,
Mhm.
the predecessors, and this link of transmission that you're not carrying it forward. And I think back to that moment as
Totally.
being like one of those moments that passed the transmission on.
Yeah. Oh, I completely think of it that way. And
Yeah.
it feels even, just listening and remembering as you're telling it, I do have a picture of her, but I feel it's not to be shown. Like you're not,
I
we
think
don't
you're
put
right.
our
Yeah.
chances with
I
that.
know. She was radiant.
She
That's
really
all I
was.
can
And
say.
she was very old and
And
yet
she was
very
very
graceful.
old. Her skin was all, wrinkled and lined, and she
Yeah.
was beaming, smile, and
And the
delighted
bells, and
we
we
were
heard
there.
the bells before we saw her, the bells of the goats, like we hear them and then she's appeared. And it was, I think for me too, that because it was also a wilder place, and this story
Yeah,
has such such a more traumatic, and for me as a therapist, it spoke so deeply to all sorts of things in therapeutic process.
yeah,
The reenactment. Sometimes you have to go and re-experience the trauma, and Demeter does, right, in this story, and but it was yeah, exactly. I mean, it's just that experience of all full body, full land, the goddess appearing, the circumambulation. That
music.
was
Yeah,
just and a totally different way to meet her. Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then we had to crawl back out. So get on the bus
Um,
on, on to the next.
Well, I remember too that there were strikes going on, and that added to the feeling of safety because it felt like no one's going to come and,
Oh, right.
no one, even if there's a report, nobody's going to respond because they're on strike. So
We're
it's
on
up
strike.
this is our chance. But again, it was her who really was the authorizing agent. But I do
But
remember just like,
we got permission to go onto the site of the mysteries.
Oh, it's really making me miss Greece. When you were talking earlier, Demetra, for preparing that food, I was just thinking about how amazing the food is in Greece and just the how alive, going to like a restaurant, family restaurant, and they bring you extra food. They're just bringing you extra that you're not even paying for. Like it's such a thing. And then the goats, though, it's really making me miss the hearing those goat bells going around Greece. That's a really great story, though. It's so
yeah. And it's also, I've just remembered also, I mean, I've remembered it all along, but in this context, you remember we were in Naupleon on that same trip, and you and I were wandering or something, and
Yeah.
we found ourselves caught up in a protest. It was when
Mhm.
Greece was really suffering under the austerities. The EU was imposing all these austerities, which is another Ceres theme, the deprivation of the I mean, it's the breadbasket of that place in many ways, and they were imposing these austerities. And we never really entirely figured out what we were marching with, but it was something in response to that in some way. And
Joined the protest march, and it
right,
was in
it was
Leon.
yeah,
Yeah.
and it feels like another Sarah now in this frame that we're in right now, I think, oh, that has its own quality because it was really a response, right, to deprivation, and at least it felt that way to us in that moment. I like we should go
Yeah.
this direction with them. Uh,
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something you wrote about in Asteroid Goddesses. I definitely like sure her. She is a protester. Like she does a strike, she like
Oh,
leading a labor strike or
yeah.
having a protest to intervene in a situation and mediate something is something else that we can definitely bring in with her. That's so powerful too. But Arcadia, you're saying that is like the place of your ancestry. Because you
yeah.
mentioned that earlier.
Yeah. Or at least my father's side of the family. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so powerful to have that experience there. Well, is
Oh,
there any other final thoughts you don't want to any either one of you share about series? It's been a really good, rich conversation.
Yeah. I want to share something, which is just
Yeah.
this moment, I'm really thinking how powerful it was for me when Gray and I decided to do our trip.
Mm,
And, you had been talking to him about it. Brian had been talking to me about it. And then we did it. And I mean, I really want to just thank you, in this moment with that, because I think it is what a gift to carry on a lineage like that and a lineage of story and dreaming and astrology and I just and going to these places, so I think Gray and I mean, I don't even know. And then, that fractal experience, where we we feel we're walking in the, in your footsteps. And I really,
mm,
as pilgrims, we're all pilgrims in this. And I just think it was really hard to describe how meaningful that part is, and especially that feeling of blessing from you of like, carry this on. There's that beautiful image of everyone will know it. Well, people interested will know it. Of Demeter and Persephone and Triptolemos, and there, and
mm.
that story comes to mind in this context. It's sort of like, go and spread the word.
right. Go spread the knowledge of agriculture
Right.
through the
Yeah,
world.
exactly. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
that's
absolutely. Yeah, I've always been indebted to you for all your astrological teaching and how much you've shaped my astrological practice. But yeah, the taking part in helping to lead a tour to these sites is just definitely life changing. There's no way to really describe how powerful it is. So yeah, it's a great honor to be part of that lineage with you. And something really encourage as many people watching or listening to this to take part in, to be able to go to these places with reverence and just connecting to the places there. And in Greece. It's
Yeah, I
really
mean, it's a
powerful.
ancient art of pilgrimage.
Hmm. And Arcadia is a real site of that. I remember Jason, you speaking about that. Arcadia in particular would be a place people would go to, like
Oh,
a
during the
in a
Grand Tour, I
romantic, the
think.
Grand Tour. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that was a big, yeah, they because they began to really idealize, I mean, accurately, but also then it got a halo, of the pastoral and the place where you could really meet the gods, which our experience is confirmatory. But that energy, and I mean, for me, that's certainly. I mean, there's so many amazing places to go there, but for me, there is some way that area, also being very much a child of Hermes, and
Mm,
his being from there as well, and it has that. A bit of a wilder take, and even just the way the rites were done at Lycosura versus at Eleusis, very, uh, in some ways more intense and violent, but
Right.
also
It's
initial,
like more wild.
more wild. Yeah, yeah,
And the landscape is wild
yeah,
itself. And
yeah.
so the landscape
yeah.
informs
Oh, yeah.
ritual.
What you can think and what you can
Yeah.
feel. Yeah, the stories you can tell.
It occurs to me now, I guess it was maybe obvious to y'all when you were sharing that story, but I'm just connecting now that she had all the goats protecting you and circumambulating, and then Pan, just because in that version
Oh, God.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
it's Pan that
Yeah.
comes to the
Yeah.
cave.
Right.
That's such a place of goats, and I mean that's why shepherds, and that's why Hermes is from there too. And but
Oh,
yeah, it's
that's
really amazing about the Pan goat connection. Yeah, wow. Um, well, thank you so much, Demetra, for being with us and talking to us about all this. This has been just wonderful to talk to you.
Right. It's been great pleasure to recollect the stories and just I don't know, the excitement of being able to share with others um, the the sort of mystery that the asteroids can bring into our astrological tradition through their mythic connections. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, I actually had a number of really powerful experiences traveling with like Pallas Athena and feeling like she
Oh,
was showing up, and I would look at my phone and be like, "Oh, there, she's on the." It kept happening. It was crazy. The asteroid would like be on an angle of the chart, and I'd be like, "Okay, yeah, there she is." um, yeah. Well, is there anything, Demetra, you have coming up you would like to just share? Or any events coming up you'd like people to know about that are watching this?
I am doing it a little bit more with the asteroids the remainder of this year. Uh, I'll be at a conference in Sedona mid-September. It's called Astrology Weekend in Sedona, where they asked me to do a pre-conference on the dark goddess
Hmm.
on asteroids. And then I'll follow that up with a webinar for Astrology University on Circe and Medea that I'm subtitling the Daughters of the Midnight Sun.
Oh,
Wow.
that's good.
Right, right. How is it that the goddesses associated with magic and mystery are the daughters of Helios, the
Yes.
bright
Yeah.
sun? But
That is
so,
awesome.
and then I want to do revisit Chiron in November. The Circe and Medea will be October 1st, and November 1st, Tony offered me a webinar date, and I said, "Hey, like that's the anniversary of
Hmm.
Chiron's discovery."
Yeah.
So I
Mm.
think I want to revisit Chiron in some specific ways. So that's
Awesome.
what we have coming up for the rest of this year.
That is very exciting. I think Circe and Medea are very like, because I've thought a lot about this whole Saturn, Neptune, and Aries, and it's Neptune and Aries being the exaltation of the sun, and not just Jason and the Argonauts and connected with the Golden Fleece, but like Medea, and she's literally like the granddaughter of the sun. Obviously,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Circe's in there too. So I feel like all of that's very alive right now with the astrology. So that's really great. Um, Yeah, and Jason, how about you? Things, anything coming up you'd like to?
It's funny. You're reminding me. Yeah, one is that with Chris Skidmore, an Australian astrologer and mythology person, we're doing an experiential reading group of the Argonautica, right, which is the Hellenistic period epic. And we'll be looking. I always give people all the asteroids connected to the different figures, and Medea is, of course, to me, the driving force of the story
Mhm.
anyway. That's for sure. And probably best for me to say that as someone named Jason. Like I need to be a Jason who has fidelity with her rather than another version. And Circe, makes her appearance there too. So that's kind of interesting. So yeah, we're going to be doing that starting September, October, like a experiential mythology. So people will be making art, we'll be looking at the asteroids, we'll be writing more by moving into one of the characters and writing as that character. Here's more of the story, dreaming it onward, in other words. And then you and I will both be at our Living Astrologies conference here in Santa Fe, which is an all experiential conference, meaning it's workshops in the mode of all kinds of different things, astrodrama, writing, movement and dance, all different things. It's actually full with a rather large waiting list, but I still want people to know about it because it's a real intervention in our astrology community to really encourage people to really seek to have direct lived experiences of astrology that really, when you bring together technique and imagination, that's when divination can happen. And so this is strong on the imagination side. It's really feeding that part of it. And Gray and Jeannie are going to do a workshop that I really love, Guardian Bear and the Imaginal Key, that I think will be amazing, and happens at the time the bear is at the top of the sky. Uh,
Mhm.
yeah, and I'm doing a Mars workshop based on really emerging from a trip to Greece, and a temple I found near the Mycenae site, the Temple of Ares in Ialios, which is kind of nobody goes there, and it was another one of those moments. So those are the two. There was, oh, and then, well, I think I would like people to know, since this will be on the YouTube, that you and I will do a night, we'll do
Mm.
our night planets course probably in, I guess, October, probably November. But that will be something where we're similar to the Twilight we're in now, but with the three traditional night planets. So
Yeah,
that would,
so Venus and Mars and the moon and mixing like some experiential astrology in with delineating type of astrology, but a little more on the experiential side. Yeah, it's been a really powerful experience doing the Twilight one with you. And yeah, I'm also really looking forward to my wife Jeannie and I are going to be at that Living Astrologies conference. I guess while we're all announcing stuff, I do have a course on secondary progressions coming up if anyone watching this is interested in taking part in that. Well, thank you all again for being with me here to talk about series. Hope everybody watching this was really opened your mind and awareness how powerful she is to work with and relate to. So thank you.